All right, everyone, how are you doing today? Welcome to my channel. My name is Thomas. I do videos on many different subjects. They are educational in nature. And today is the 69th video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory of Dewey B. Larson. Mr. Larson was born back in 1898, and up until the day he died in 1990, his whole, almost all of his adult life he spent working on refining the reciprocal system of theory, which he laid out in his two initial postulates in the 1950s. The general idea of his theory of everything is that the universe is not made out of matter. The universe is not made out of energy, but the universe is made out of motion. Matter and energy are both forms of motion, as is every other scientific phenomenon. They're all relationships between space and time. Motion is the relationship between space and time. Space and time are reciprocals of each other, hence the reciprocal system of theory. That basically means that you have fractions, you have relationships, time over space or space over time. But space and time both have the same qualities. And one of those qualities we know of about space is that it's multidimensional. We say three-dimensional. You can also say four-dimensional, depending on whether you want to use cubic coordinates, X, Y, Z coordinates, or tetrahedral coordinates. But that also means that time has three dimensions in the same way that space does. Time, what we know about time is that time is progressing. It's always getting later and later and later. It's flowing. So that is also true about space. Space flows, or space is always getting further and further apart. And we can detect that. The Hubble telescope detected that way back in the 1920s with the recession of the distant galaxies. Now, space and time are also quantized, meaning that there is a minimum unit of time, and there's a minimum unit of space. 1 unit. There's no less than 1. 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time, space over time is speed. 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time is the speed of light. So unlike Einstein, who says that the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe, in the universe of motion of Dewey-Larson, the speed of light is the midpoint or the neutral point of the universe. And there is a half of the universe that actually moves faster than the speed of light, as well as the half that we're familiar with that moves slower than the speed of light. The slower than speed of light side he calls the material sector, or sector 1. And the faster than speed of light sector he calls the cosmic sector, or sector 2. And they are divided by the speed of light boundary. Now, when you cross the speed of light boundary, all you have to do is invert the relationships of space and time. So in sector 1, we have basically space over time relationships. But in sector 2, we have time over space relationships. And over there in sector 2, time is three-dimensional with XYZ coordinates, and space is progressing. Whereas in sector 1, space is got the three-dimensional coordinates and time is progressing. That's what we're used to. But over here, relationships are inverted. But through extrapolation, we can figure out what's going on in sector 2 now, because it's the same as what's going on in sector 1, except that they are inverted. Now, sector 1 grows by aggregation. Things cling on to each other, and eventually the atoms and molecules grow to their most complicated or complex form, that being the DNA molecule, which contains billions of atoms. And at this point, the DNA molecule becomes eligible to be taken over or controlled by a sector 2 unit. And that sector 2 unit, even though it is a minor part of the overall structure of the combination, it actually controls the environment of sector 1 body. And that is what Larson calls the life unit. Life is a combination of sector 1 and sector 2 in the right components, the right ratio, and the right configuration. And then life grows or develops and up to its most complicated, complex form, which Larson calls the intelligent human being or humanoid. And at that point, life becomes eligible to be taken over or controlled by a sector 3 unit. Now, sector 3 is what Larson says is actually beyond space and time, the metaphysical region, independent of space and time. Possibly you could think of it as the origin of space and time. The ancient legends and holy books called it God or the spiritual world. Larson calls it sector 3. And sector 3 communicates with sector 1 through transmission mechanisms. And those can be called variously intuition, ESP, scientific insight, religious revelation. They're all the same communications from sector 3. Now, what happens is that the human being or all life units are controlled by sector 2, and sector 2 is predicates itself upon survival. That is the goal of sector 2. But the goal of sector 3 is ethical behavior and ethical or good behavior. And so there are times, as Larson talked about last episode, when sector 1 and or sector 2 and sector 3 work harmoniously and are governed by the same, they have the same goals. But there are also times where sector 2 and sector 3 work at cross purposes and have to be decided. The human being has to decide which one of those goals they're going to pursue, whether they're going to pursue ethical behavior or survival behavior. And that is the crux of the free will problem. And so we are looking at Larson's final book here, Beyond Space and Time. This is the book where he delves into metaphysics, the philosophical, the religious, the psychological. And we are in chapter 17 that is called Free Will. So we're going to resume right here in the middle of the chapter. He's talking about causation and determinism, and he was talking about how a lot of the modern physics, quantum physics, doesn't really have a real strong connection with either causation or free will, and that he was using the example of atomic disintegration or decay, radioactive decay, and that quantum physics can tell you statistically how many atoms are going to decay in a certain amount of time, but they can't tell you which atoms or why. And so he's going to start right here. In a similar manner, we can often identify something that we call the cause of a physical event, but this identification necessarily involves a somewhat arbitrary exclusion of items that have contributed to the causation. Furthermore, the designated cause itself is the result of other causes. On this basis, the events at the atomic level to which modern physics is unable to assign any causes originate from the interaction of causal systems in the same manner as the familiar events of our everyday experience. The explanation which the reciprocal system supplies for the seemingly anomalous atomic events is that physical objects can change their relative positions in time as well as in space. And most of the events that occur at the atomic level are the results of changes of location in time, either in addition to or in lieu of location changes in space. The difficulty that has been experienced in applying the laws of classical physics to atomic and subatomic events is due to the fact that these laws are governing motion in space. The changes of position in time that take place in these events are not governed by the laws of space motion, but by other laws that are different from, although related to, the spatial laws. Now, so remember, in the sector 1, time is flowing. That's the scalar motion of time. It has a direction. It has no direction. It just has a magnitude. It's either in or out. It's not, 30 degrees northwest or something like that. But in the sector 2, time is in coordinate time, meaning it has X, Y, Z coordinates. So time does have a direction. And so that's what he's talking about. When you're talking about things at the atomic level, the motion in time is coordinate time, and that's not being accounted for by modern physics. They're only accounting for motion in space. Motion in time is the reciprocal of the motion in space, but the directions in time are not directions in space. They are directions in time. So it's hard to conceive of that, but it's consistent throughout the way that Larson applies it. Okay, the changes of position that in time that take place in these events are not governed by the laws of space motion, but by other laws that are different from, although related to, the spatial laws. When these atomic events are viewed in their proper context, they are not random and unpredictable as pictured by quantum theory. They are just as regular and orderly as the macroscopic processes that follow the classical laws. The same causal relationships that apply to ordinary, everyday physical processes are therefore applicable to these atomic events as well. Every event at the atomic or subatomic level is the result of the intersection of two or more causal systems. Determinism, however, is ruled out by another of the findings of the reciprocal system. Earlier physical theories considered the universe as being made up of things, entities possessing a rather vague attribute known as substance. The issue of determinism versus indeterminism was simply a question as to whether the laws governing the motions of these things were definite and specific enough to enable accurate prediction of the later motions from a knowledge of the earlier ones. But the development of the reciprocal system now shows that substance is motion of a particular kind, and the things are therefore nothing but motions. Furthermore, there is a continual interchange between the things and other types of motion. In many events, particularly where the dimensions of motion are altered, or where motion in space and motion in time are interchanged, the exact nature of the resultant is a matter of chance. At these points, Causality is maintained as always, but the deterministic chain is broken. The contentions that an invariable sequence is essential to causality and the same cause must always have the same result are therefore erroneous. In some classes of events, determinism prevails, and the exact nature of the result can be predicted if we have a full knowledge of the cause or causes. But in other classes of events, the actual result may be any one of a number of potential results. Determinism as a general physical principle is thus invalid. Denial of determinism is not, however, sufficient to establish the existence of free will. The essence of free will is the choice, but physical mechanisms have no choice. As a result, a result produced by chance process is just as specific and definite as if it had been produced by a fully deterministic process. Free will exists only if the result that would have been produced by the normal physical processes, chance or determinate as the case may be, can be overruled at the option of that will. And such a thing is totally foreign to the physical world. Both living and non-living physical units must follow the rules of their respective sectors, Sector 1 and Sector 2. A mechanism has no will of its own. Free will is necessarily metaphysical, that is, non-physical, that is, Sector 3. This is the inescapable fact that has driven the strict mechanist, whether he be a scientist or philosopher, into a denial of the reality of free will. The concept of free will is a logical monstrosity, a contradiction, a fiction, says some philosopher. Those that are inclined toward the mechanistic viewpoint but are unwilling to take such a radical stand recognize that we are confronted with a dilemma. This is one of man's oldest riddles. How can the independence of human volition be harmonized with the fact that we are integral parts of a universe which is subject to the rigid order of nature's laws? That was Max Planck. Most scientists would prefer to believe in the existence of free will, but like Planck, they see no way in which this freedom can be reconciled with the physical laws to which man, as well as the rest of the physical universe, is subject. They are not impressed by the arguments advanced by those philosophers who champion free will. And so then he's going to get into some other philosophical positions. Quoting Trueblood, he says, the most powerful argument against determinism is that it utterly destroys any logical basis of responsibility. And Larson says, this is outright circularity. The argument rests entirely on the assumption that man must be responsible for his actions. But he cannot be held responsible unless he has freedom of action. The premise on which this argument for the existence of free will is based is therefore equivalent to assuming freedom of the will. Other philosophy texts approach the responsibility issue in a different way, contending that human recognition of a sense of personal responsibility is evidence of its existence. And so then he goes into a little bit of a digression. So the scientist has been left in an awkward position where that which he intuitively feels to be correct is in direct conflict with the information that he derives from by the logical and factual methods of inquiry to which he and his profession are committed. The question now arises, is the conflict between the scientific and intuitive viewpoints actually as irreconcilable as it seems? There are those who would cut the Gordian knot by repudiating some of the principles of science, such as Bergson calls the law of conservation of energy a psychological mistake and proposes throwing it overboard to make room for free will. But the conservation laws are just as firmly grounded in the reciprocal system as in conventional science. And the new information developed in the course of the present work therefore gives no support to such a suggestion. The whole idea of sacrificing established physical principles as a means of avoiding conflicts is unscientific, and all proposals of this nature will have to be rejected. It would be feasible, however, for any agency capable of modifying the normal results of chance processes to overrule the purely physical response to a mental stimulus. The mental mechanisms operate electrically, and the exact nature of the interactions between the individual electrical units, the electrons, and the atoms of matter is largely determined by chance. A deliberate modification of these interaction patterns could conceivably make a major change in the ultimate result of a mental process. Such an intervention would conflict with what are called the laws of probability, but as noted in the discussion of miracles, these probability laws are on a somewhat different footing than the physical laws in that they are based on a concept that is indefinable other than empirically. All definitions of probability depend on the concept of equally likely events, and no one has been able to specify what this means. Okay, we're going to stop there and resume the conversation or the reading tomorrow. Hope you have a great day, and hope to see you back tomorrow. Signing off.